Thank you, Marie-Alix, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this macroeconomic series, which will be dedicated to the US economic prospects in light with the incoming Biden administration. We all know that forecasting economics from a political agenda is always a very difficult exercise. First, we need to distinguish in the program in between what is written for election and what is written for future policy. We need to assess what can be done given the established forces. And we need to understand how the administration can navigate and adapt to unexpected circumstances. For the Biden administration, the task is enormous. After 4 years of diplomatic and institutional turbulence, and the fight against the COVID crisis being rolled out, several domestic, social, and economic priorities have to be addressed very quickly. While, in the same time, international relationships have to be restored. To help us understand the future policy of the US administration and the economic impact, I'm pleased to welcome the two co-chairs of the newly curated Macroeconomics Committee, Sarah Carlson, Senior Vice President at the Sovereign Risk Group with Moody's, and Tristan Perrier, Economist at Amundi. Let's start with you, Sarah. You know well the US Constitution and is studied at the George Washington University. It's a very complex constitution, as we have noticed over the past 4 years. Can you explain to us, under the Constitution and the current state of the Congress, both Senate and House of Representatives, what the President can do? What are the checks and balances? In short, what are the room to maneuver for Biden?
Thanks very much, Jean-Philippe. Now, the question you've just asked me is actually the subject of entire courses of university political science programs. So I'm going to try to boil this down in sort of 5 to 7 minutes for people. So if we start with what the president can do. Joe Biden, of course, can pass what are called executive orders. And Tristan's certainly going to be talking a bit more about some of what Joe Biden has done and aspires to do through executive orders. There's a perception that executive orders have increased significantly over time. In preparation for this, I went and looked at the count per year for presidents. And actually, it's fluctuated over time. In the late 19th and early 20th century, it was actually used a lot more frequently than it is now. But in recent years, presidents have had a preference for particularly passing things like regulatory changes through executive orders. Now, this has the advantage of expediency. The president can basically do this at the stroke of the pen. They may be challenged in the court system later, but basically the president has quite a lot of autonomy over doing this. The downside is that if there's a change of administration, those executive orders can just as quickly be rescinded, as we saw from quite a large number of executive orders that Joe Biden signed on his very first day in office. So that's the easy way. The harder way is through legislation. And you can see that this is what the Biden administration is spending a lot of their time and energy on right now. Joe Biden is a creature of the Senate. He was elected to the Senate when he was in his 30s. He knows the institution extremely well. And they are trying to push measures through the Senate. Now, there are two ways to really simplify this down that things can pass. There's passing legislation, which sounds straightforward. But now this isn't a constitutional issue, but it is a procedural issue. There is one complication, which is something called the filibuster. You'll be hearing a lot about the filibuster in the next hour and over the next few years if you're following American policy and politics. What the filibuster says is that, in principle, in order to pass some legislation, you need to get 60 votes. Now, in the past, the filibuster wasn't invoked very often. I have the time series looking over every US Congress, and you can use as a proxy votes for cloture, which is a procedural issue in the Senate. And this was pretty unusual over the course of a Senate in the late 80s, the early 90s. We're talking about between like 10 and 25 times over the course of a 2-year term for the new Congress. This has grown exponentially since 2008. But what the filibuster means is that you need to have not a simple majority to pass legislation, but 60 votes. Now, it is true that the Democrats control both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but the Democrats' control of the Senate could not be more razor thin. The seats, there are 100 seats in the US Senate, 50 are held by Republicans or those who caucus with the Republicans, 50 are held by Democrats or those who caucus with the Democrats. There's a tie-breaking vote, which is the Vice President of the United States, who's also the President of the Senate, which means that if the Democrats want to pass any legislation through straightforward legislative means, they need to get a number of Republican senators on side. Now that's possible, but makes things a bit more challenging. You can't just count on a simple party line vote. There is another way to pass legislation, and you're going to hear a lot about this if you're following the stimulus that the Biden administration wants to pass. This is passing through what's called budget reconciliation. This was introduced in 1974, and it started life as a really simple process of trying to reconcile, as the name suggests, what was in the budget and what actually got spent. What it's turned into, especially with the increasing use of the filibuster, is another way to pass legislation, particularly expenditure legislation, because you only need a simple majority. There are some restrictions over this. There's something called the Byrd Rule, which means that legislation cannot be deficit creating after 10 years. But ultimately, this is a way that a lot of legislation can be passed. And this is the way that probably most of the Biden stimulus program will actually be passed through the Congress. As I say, there are some restrictions around how it can be used. It can't be used for absolutely everything. They will, if they want to achieve some of their goals, and we can talk about some of those in a few minutes, need to actually pass legislation by being able to get at least 60 votes. But for at least this major stimulus package, budget reconciliation is the way they're going to go. Oh, I think you might be on mute, Jean-Philippe.
Jean-Philippe, you're on mute.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. So we see that there is a complex institution. We can use executive order, we can use filibuster or budget reconciliation. So Tristan, on your side, Biden has a vast and very ambitious program. We know that many parties will push for their own interest. From your understanding of the program, what are the key priorities for Biden and what must be implemented urgently?
Hello, thank you, Sarah and Jean-Philippe. So yes, when it comes to the Biden priorities, I would stress 4 items. Item 1 is very obviously getting the country out of the COVID pandemic, both from a medical standpoint and also from an economic standpoint. Biden has promised from the medical standpoint to vaccinate 100 million people in his first 100 days, which would mean by 20th of April. And the vaccination campaign is going quite well, actually, especially when you compare with what is occurring in the EU. I think the US today has 34 million people that have gotten the first dose, roughly 10 million people for the second dose. So he could well be on track to fulfill this promise quite well. And then obviously COVID support is also the main reason and the purpose of this very large stimulus bill that Sarah has just described, that will act both through supporting household income and also facilitating the work of local administration for vaccination. So that's topic one. Then topic two is the longer term democratic, social and economic agenda, which you could summarize as building a more inclusive society, trying to address what is largely perceived in the United States and also in the rest of the world as an excessive concentration of wealth and corporate power within the hands of a minority in the United States. So there are several tools, of course, to pursue this very ambitious and complex agenda. There are obviously intentions of new spending programs on social and infrastructure that will come after the COVID bill that is about to pass now. Then there are potentially tax increases, and I think this is quite an important item, because I believe many people, especially on financial markets, may be somewhat underestimating the probability that the Democrats are going to fulfill some of the promises in their agenda to raise taxes. So I would identify 4 types of taxes that are more likely than others to be increased. These include the corporate income tax with a promise to re-increase it from 21% to 28%. Presumably, as well, the tax on foreign earnings of US corporations, then the personal income tax, especially for people that earn more than $400,000 per year, and then probably another candidate could be the estate tax, where you could both modify the rate and the ceiling. There are a number of other taxes within the democratic agenda. They are wealth tax, capital gain tax, and financial transaction taxes. We tend to believe that these are a bit less likely to pass, including due to opposition from the moderates within the ranks of the Democrats themselves. So tool 1 is new spending. Tool 2 is taxes. Then there is the promise to rise the minimum wage by quite a large amount, but that one will be difficult to fulfill due to the Congress equilibria that Sarah has discussed. I will give a bit more details later on that topic. And then there are a number of regulatory reforms, some of whom indeed can be done through executive action of the president and not necessarily requiring Congress, although you will require Congress for other decisions. So topic 1, COVID. Topic 2, the long-term democratic agenda, build a more inclusive society. Then there's, of course, although it seems that it's a bit less of an urgent priority now, but it will nonetheless impose itself in the agenda. There are international affairs. Here, I think that the perceived message in the rest of the world is that it's stated as America is back within the normal working of normal system of international relations. America is back rather than America first under Trump. The reality is a bit more complex than this, and I'll elaborate on this a bit later on as well. But the key ideas, and this is stated very clearly, is to mend relations with allies, work through multilateral organizations in order to face competitors and adversaries more efficiently. And then, of course, the second very large part is try to find the right approach towards China, how to build, to think, to craft a patient yet firm approach to find the right China containment strategy. I think these are the 2 main directions of Biden's international plans. And then topic 4 would be climate change issue. This is very large also in the democratic program, and I would not include it really in the domestic nor in the international agenda, because it is very obviously at the intersection of both, as is, I think, very symbolically shown by how the special presidential envoy for climate, who's John Kerry, has been given a very senior ranking position in the administration and a seat within the National Security Council. So climate change will be an essential part of both internal and international affairs. I think, to summarize, for a first summary, these would be the main priorities of the administration.
Thank you, Tristan. So, Sarah, Tristan mentioned fight against COVID and inequality, fight against inequality. What's your understanding of the current stimulus being discussed at the moment, the 1.9 trillion after the 900 trillion that has been just voted in December? And from what your start, from your start of the discussion, how this stimulus can be effectively voted by presidency decree or by the House of, by the Congress. How will it work? And will it really address the two key priorities that Tristan mentioned, inequality and fight against COVID?
Thanks, Jean-Philippe. I mean, I think what the stimulus, I mean, it is absolutely a massive stimulus bill, is really there to do is to really help to jumpstart the economy and help give some American families that have really been struggling during this period a bit of relief. And the highest profile part of this is actually direct payments. This is very famous, $1,400 direct payments to all Americans subject to some income, some means testing. And also an expansion of federal unemployment benefits because, of course, there has been a very significant increase in unemployment and also a decrease in the labor force participation rate in the US. And so one of the things they're wanting to do is get people back into the labor force, and help support people during this period of elevated unemployment, which is probably unavoidable given the public health situation. Those are the most high profile elements of this. But there's also something that's quite evident when you look at the priorities. There's a lot of support for American families in this. There are things like direct annual payments that they're talking about, to again subject to some income income means testing. There's an idea of baby bonds that every American, when they turn, I think it's 18, gets a certain amount that can be used for higher education. It can be used for vocational training. It can be used as something to help even just be a down payment on an apartment, I would imagine. There's aid to schools and also aid for childcare. So I think this is really, it's only the first step. And I think the administration's made it very clear that this is the first step in them trying to deal with not just the economic aftermath of the pandemic, but start to deal with some of the issues around inequality. But there's a lot more that this administration aspires to do, much of which will be more difficult. Now, most of this, the minimum wage is still part of this bill, and there is some question about whether that can pass through budget reconciliation. But those are, I think, the real highlights of this. So again, I don't think this, though it's $1.9 trillion stimulus, is intended to be the answer to the problem of inequality. It's a far more complex problem than that. But it's intended to give American citizens, especially those who've been really struggling, a bit of relief, and to then pave the way for other parts of their program, things like infrastructure spending, which we'll come on and talk about later, which is also an incredibly important aspect of their agenda. And I think you'll see in the Biden agenda, there's an inequality angle to a lot of the projects that they're talking about. There's no way you could have an inequality bill. It's more trying to think about ways through other legislation that, among other things, some of the causes of inequality and some of the impact of inequality can be addressed or mitigated.
Thank you, Sarah. So the Biden administration is ready to put a lot of money in the economy. But Tristan, you were mentioning regulation. How this administration will balance in between putting the money to restart the economy and addressing regulation shortfall. We think about the financial sector, but there are plenty of other areas like consumer protection, energy, tech, and so on. What's your understanding of where the administration will start in the front of regulation?
Yes, thank you. Well, when it comes to regulation, there are some items that are quite easy to do, and a number of them have already been done in the first days since Biden's inauguration. And then, of course, there are incredibly complex topics where this mandate may or may not initiate decisive regulatory change, but they could well extend well beyond the mandate. Obviously, as Sarah mentioned, there's the possibility there's the possibility to use these presidential executive action, of whom Trump used a lot in his own mandate. In principle, so you do not need Congress when the president doesn't need Congress when taking these executive actions. In principle, they must not involve new spending, yet they can be quite far-reaching in a number of sectors. Again, as shown under Trump, and obviously the limits are not always clear. You sometimes expose yourself, the president would expose his decision to legal action if opponents consider that it's the kind of decision that should have required Congress approval. And obviously it can trigger some regulatory instability, as stated by Sarah, because the principle for Biden is that he can basically undo everything that Trump did through these regulatory actions, but then come another Republican president, everything that Biden has done through this channel can for sure be undone. So as I said, Biden has already taken a number of decisions, either on day one or just very shortly after his inauguration. I'm not going to go in all his decisions here, just maybe stating a few ones. Some were about COVID, like making masks compulsory in transport and in public transportations and in federal premises, stricter tests for foreign travelers. Some related to general health coverage, like he decided to open a special additional enrollment period in the coming weeks for more people to be covered by Obamacare platform. He increased the advertising also for enrollment. Then there were a number of bills on the social, racial equality and immigration themes, like for instance, an extension of renters moratorium during COVID, an extension of forbearance for student loans, some decisions to reunite families on this difficult topic of immigrant families that were separated by Trump policies, some expansion of refugee programs, a freeze also on the border wall construction. So many of the symbolic items that Trump had decided through executive action were just undone by Biden. Also a number, and this is quite important, of course, to gauge the general direction of policies. Also a number of decisions relative to the Buy American rules, Buy American intentions, closing a number of loopholes, reducing waivers that administrations or corporations have to try to escape these Buy American rules, and obviously a number of decisions on climate change. Symbolically, climate change was elevated officially as an essential element of foreign policy. He also decided a freeze on that very long-dated topic of the pipeline, the Keystone pipeline with Canada. Other decisions a few days later to halt new fossil fuel extraction on public land, on offshore waters, and some elimination of fuel subsidies. So quite far-reaching decisions, and also in international relations, as you have certainly heard, rejoining the Paris Agreement, rejoining the WHO, and that is also worth mentioning a few regulatory decisions to modify the regulatory process itself, especially to check that any further regulatory action would be preceded by a careful impact study, especially relatively to their distributional effects, because we know how sometimes some left-oriented measures that are initiated with good intentions can sometimes have unexpected or counterproductive distributional effects. So he has also tried to better prepare the regulatory framework to take more regulatory actions later on. But then to go further, more complicated decisions will obviously require a lot more time, and some of them also require approval from Congress when it involves spending. So Sarah and I have already mentioned this federal minimum wage increase. The stated plan by the Democrats is very ambitious. As you may know, the federal minimum wage is at $7.25 and has been there since 2009. No increase since then. And the Democrats officially plan to increase it to $15 by 2025. Yeah, however, as Sarah said, it is not in principle eligible to the reconciliation process. It will probably have to be dropped from the stimulus bill, despite Bernie Sanders' best effort to try to persuade that yes, it has some budgetary impacts, so should be left in the bill. And so basically to do this, because it would matter quite a lot, especially on inflation expectations, if they could engineer such a rise in the federal minimum wage, well, basically you would need to bring Republicans on board. That is quite challenging. It may not be 100% impossible, because I think 2/3 of Americans support an increase in the minimum wage. But so far, I'm not aware of signs given by the Republicans that they could join such a decision. Then there are, of course, other regulatory issues. One is our financial sector. On this, Biden is much less, I would say, hawkish than other Democratic candidates, especially Elizabeth Warren. My take on this, although there's not much clarity and visibility at this stage, is that the focus would not be so much on banks. I think banks are quite safe from too stringent new regulation. That may not be a priority. We are not in 2010. Banks are not seen as the root of the current crisis. They may actually be rather part of the solution. However, I think there's plenty of new scope for financial regulation on all these new actors. It can be crypto, it can be retail trading platforms, it can be hedge funds as well. And very obviously, the GameStop episode has brought an interesting case on the desk of Janet Yellen to decide to what extent you should tighten regulation, because there's so much this perception that the system is geared and twisted in favor of Wall Street insiders. So on financial regulation, my take would be that it would be rather on these new and more exotic activities than on mainstream banks. And then there's a very, very large sector of big tech regulation, a topic that has been around for quite a long time, but so far without so many bold and far-reaching regulatory decisions. I believe a number of observers believe that the see and feel that the wind is gradually turning against these GAFAM, very large tech companies. There are many more and more state level and federal investigations against them. Of course, authorities must be careful in this topic. We know that for the stock exchange, but also for the general economy, these very big tech players are very much the pace setters nowadays of a general economic activity. And you should also mind that they're not so unpopular with the general population. Amazon is nowhere as unpopular as banks were during the Lehman episode, for instance. Many people actually appreciate the services they are providing. So I think interestingly, however, Republicans could be brought on board. I think that if there is a room, an area where there could be some bipartisan policy, it could be this one. A number of Republican lawmakers are getting more and more wary of big tech power. However, when it comes to Biden, I think he's quite moderate on the topic. Many in his team are quite tech friendly. I think he's nowhere as naive and enthusiastic as Obama was relatively to the sector, but he's not that hawkish either. So it's not a done deal that monopolies or quasi-monopolies in that sector will be broken anytime soon. I think it's going to take a lot of time. It will be an extremely complex process. There's no visibility at this stage on what really breakup could look like, but we should not forget two things. The first is that the US have a long-dated monopoly breaking tradition. Think Standard Oil, think ATT, that was somewhat interrupted, that has been somewhat interrupted since the Reagan era, but there's a history of bipartisan efforts to break big monopolies. And plenty of conclusion that it was actually good for business and even for the combined stock prices of the breakup, accumulated stock prices of the broken up companies in the end. And then there's also generally, even among Republicans, that feeling that nowadays the economy cannot be completely left to market forces alone. So a very big topic to be followed, extremely important for the stock exchange. I think some regulation would come. To what extent exactly and with what agenda, I'm not so sure. And then to end up with this topic, obviously there's a very large also issue of health regulation. We know how large the perception is that the US health system is very unequal. I think here we should expect a number of decisions. For instance, to extend the Obamacare coverage. Before the COVID crisis, 30 million Americans were uncovered by Obamacare. It looks like we don't have detailed numbers, but millions more may have lost coverage when they lost their jobs during the COVID crisis. So Biden has intentions to extend the coverage and also to do a number of modifications, especially a key modification within along his promises is to add a public affordable insurance option within Obamacare. Perhaps also lower the Medicare age, which is currently 64 to 60. So, and a number of other decisions on subsidies and the eligibility thresholds and premium prices. All in all, that should not be as far-reaching as the Medicare for all that other more left-winger candidate within the Democratic Party had, but a series of decisions on that front could nonetheless be quite substantial. Now, the question is that not everything can be done through executive action, obviously. People that have investigated the entire health program of Biden have come up with a number of 750 billion for this amount. Very obviously, you need Congress, and therefore you may need to use one of your limited shots at reconciliation during the mandate.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have a first question for the audience, Marie-Alix. You mentioned tech companies, you mentioned stock market, Tristan, and we've seen, you mentioned GameStop, sorry. So at this stage, Marie-Alix, if you have the polling question to propose to the audience, otherwise we will do it. Yeah. Just before going to this question, the question on the Fed. The Fed is part of supporting the stimulus plan, and there will be a question at some point on up to when the Fed will be effectively going to the inflation risk. So, first question to the audience, what is the timing for the Fed effective tapering in your view? 2021, later on 2022 first half, or later?
Just giving it a few more seconds for everyone to respond.
It's quite split. At least 2021 is in minority of almost of the table. 2022 first half. That means that the economy,
well-balanced results, I believe, of the poll.
is restarting in 21
quite
and
symmetric.
ready for 22, and effectively later for those who think the economy we need longer to restart. Just as a kind reminder, you can still ask your question on the chat for the Q&A after this discussion. Just let's move on this on the program of Biden. Sarah, you explained to us the complexity of the political system in the US and the various ways the Biden administration can implement what they are willing to do. What do you see the much harder to implement with all the reforms that Tristan mentioned? But what can be hard to implement, but realistically good to implement?
Sure, and actually we've received a question in the chat that anticipated exactly this question as well. So thank you very much for the question. We thought people would be interested in this. On the minimum wage, it's not impossible that it could pass through budget reconciliation. That'll ultimately be the call of one of the parliamentarians who will decide if who can decide if it's eligible or not. So that could be something that will be proposed. It's worth bearing in mind when you're thinking about this, for me to back up and just talk about the dynamics of this Senate, because Tristan's talked a lot about some of the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, some more progressive politicians. But if I were to mention two names to you who are probably some of the most powerful people in Washington right now, without question, putting aside the president himself, it would actually be Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Kristen Sinema of Arizona. These are more conservative Democrats, and really for any legislation to have a chance of being able to pass the filibuster barrier, they would need to be on board. It seems very, very unlikely that you would get bipartisan support for legislation that didn't get Joe Manchin on board, for example. And that's probably going to be a fairly moderating influence on the policy agenda. It's pretty clear that after the stimulus passes, one of the next big legislative projects for the new administration is going to be infrastructure. The administration has big, ambitious goals for infrastructure. It sees infrastructure spending as one of the ways that some kinds of inequality can be addressed. It also sees it as an important source of job creation. Remember, I talked about labor force participation declining, higher unemployment. Infrastructure projects are something that can certainly help to put Americans back to work. It can also form part of the climate agenda, so part of a greening of the economy. So infrastructure touches a lot of areas. Now, this is going to be very complex legislation. Infrastructure spending is very popular. It's very popular in a bipartisan way. It's popular if you look at opinion polls. But the devil's always in the details. I mean, Donald Trump came to office saying that he wanted to spend big on infrastructure, and there was sort of a running joke among journalists in Washington that every week was infrastructure week. But nothing got, but a big infrastructure piece of legislation didn't get passed. And so that means that it's complicated. The ambitions are big, and Biden's made it clear that he wants to go big. The potential is certainly there, but others who have tried have really struggled. I think another thing, and it doesn't have particular economic relevance, but it certainly has social relevance in the US, is legislation around voting rights. There's been a whole discussion around elections, voting rights, the ability to, the ability to vote in different ways in the US. This is also a very complicated issue. That's also going to be fairly high on the agenda. But I think, again, if I were to target one thing which I think is going to be discussed heavily, has a significant economic impact, and which could pass the filibuster test, then it would be infrastructure. But remember, the other goal of Joe Biden, it's to address income inequality, it's to help America get through this horrible public health crisis. But of course, like every other president, he wants to have a successful midterm election. And infrastructure spending would be something I think you would hear a lot about in the run-up to the midterm elections in 2022. Remember, just because the president serves a 4-year term, every member of the House of Representatives is up for re-election every 2 years. Senators serve a 6-year term, and those are staggered with roughly a third of the Senate being up for election every 2 years. And typically, U.S. presidents lose support, or the party of the U.S. president loses support in the midterm elections. Doesn't always happen, didn't happen with George W. Bush, but in general, this is the fate that Joe Biden is also going to want to avoid, basically so that he can continue to pass his agenda throughout a 4-year term. But the window is narrow because 2022 elections will be here before you know it.
Just before moving to the international affair, we have another question another question for the audience, and we were mentioning just before the tech sector, the fact that the tech sector was a big winner of the pandemic, the fact that the stock market is somewhat irrational at some point. Marie-Alix, can you launch a second question? Yeah. So shall we expect going forward that the Nasdaq will normalize, or shall we continue on the trend that we are seeing at the moment? So the Nasdaq performance in 2021, negative, positive, but less than 25%, or more than 25%. It's up to you.
Again, just a few more seconds to log in your answers.
It's quite clear that going to increasing Nasdaq, but less than 25%. It won't reduce inequality, but
it's not evenly distributed in the population. No,
it is definitely not. No.
Thank you. So let's go to the international affair. Tristan, the relationship between Trump and its international partners have been quite challenged during the past 4 years on all fronts, whether it's trade, whether it's economics, whether it's military. So shall we expect normalization in international affairs coming from the US? If yes, what will be the future of the relation in between the US and its main partners, China, Europe, and to a lesser extent, the Middle East?
Well, I believe normalization is really the stated word with Europe. For China, of course, it's a lot more complicated as Chinese power, wealth, influence has been continuously increasing even during the Trump mandate. I think the general paradigm, the general message that this administration is sending is that they want to be back to a cooperative approach with allies, rally Western democracies around the promotion of the so-called liberal international order. They want to work through multilateral organizations, persuade allies and the country that it's when playing by the rules within the organizations that you obtain the best results, and also quite importantly play reputational soft power. Biden diplomats have stressed the catastrophic drop in US popularity ratings abroad during the Trump mandate, and of course they want to amend this and believe it's part of the international policy objectives. Now, the main challenge is obviously the relationship with China. The intended direction here is to try to find a patient yet careful yet firm and more comprehensive than under Trump approach to China containment. Biden himself had quite strong words against China during the campaign. He has just recently said, if you have listened to his interview, a very recent interview on CBS, we need not have a conflict, but there is going to be extreme competition, but we will not do it Trump's way. We are going to focus on international rules. I believe China is seen not only as an economic and military rival, and not first and foremost as a trade rival, unlike under Trump, but as more and more a rival model, a threat to this liberal world order brought by an authoritarian state whose power is largely based on control of mass data technology, some form of high-tech, new form of high-tech authoritarian system. Yet they so how do they want to work to contain China and maintain US power? There's working through alliances that could be of course existing alliances, be it in Europe or in the Pacific. They've also hinted, a number of diplomats have also hinted at new frameworks, for instance the Quad, which informally unites Australia, Japan, India together with the US. There's also the British proposal of a D10 that has attracted attention from Biden's advisors for Asia. D10 means G10 plus India, Australia, and South Korea. However, they acknowledge that it is not always wise to force countries to choose US versus China. There's a will to contain, but there's also a will not to fall into some form of 20th century-like Cold War trap, like the situation with the Soviet Union. There are plenty of differences with the Cold War situation. Obviously, there's a lot more economic interdependence. There's much less. There is frontal ideological opposition, but much less than with the Soviet Union. But administration officials, while stating that they want to be firm with China, also almost always indicate that there's also room for cooperation when it is in the US interest, and it is not always necessary to treat China as hostile. Indeed, that would be the best way to indeed make it an outright enemy. So, in a bit more details, that agenda of China containment will probably be much less trade-oriented and again much more comprehensive than under Trump. There's no question of forcing China to buy US goods, and no such focus on what I would call good old trade 20th century style in manufactured products. There is for sure, there is even the possibility, I believe that it's quite likely by the end of the mandate that the China tariffs could be removed, because many US observers believe that they're harming the US economy. Obviously, Biden has also said that they would not be removed right now, but that can be traded for a number of concessions. Now, the US wants to make supply chains less dependent from China, but they also want to push for containment further in other areas which were a bit less developed under Trump. It would be unfair to say that they did not exist, but they want to be pushed further. That could be tech containment, restrictions to investment, and obviously there's a stronger emphasis than under Trump on enforcement of human rights. Although a number of advisors on this precise chapter have stated and warned that it would be counterproductive to try to push defense of human rights in a kind of a selective way or opportunistic way. It has to be constant and gradual and equal towards all countries. To go even in a bit more detail, some careful studies of the Biden's advisors on Asia, such as Eli Ratner, who has been tasked with 15 other counselors and given 4 months to craft that strategy. I think there's a special focus on the threat of China as a norm setter. We know that norm setting, especially in technology, is always a key element of soft power. It's actually it's a quite relatively cheap but very efficient way to exert influence, and US advisors are quite wary that China could set norms in a number of new technologies that include electric cars, obviously, 6G communication, and also importantly, city surveillance. You've heard of all these facial recognition technologies. They fear that by selling these technologies to quite a number of countries already, China is both getting mass data, obtaining mass data from these countries, and it is also, since these projects relate to infrastructure, to management of people and territories, they also somewhat legitimize the Chinese Communist Party's way of conducting this management. So they sometimes embed exports, some form of Chinese organization, and the US wants to patiently, carefully, because obviously it's not easy, counter this form of soft power. So what the US wants to do, according to these advisors, is to promote high quality, high standard investments abroad, trying to persuade other countries that it is also by ensuring personal freedom, the Western way, that you obtain the best economic results, and also from a soft power stance, try to lead by climate change, set the example in terms of climate change. This is again a very important direction of Biden policies. And also very importantly, the US firmly believes that the democratic social agenda and foreign policy are inseparable. You cannot really defend the US model if you do not fix your own social rifts at home. So there's very often this idea that the two are very closely, social policies at home and foreign policies are very closely connected. Now, when it comes to the relationship with Europe, it will obviously, the tone is obviously a lot more friendly. In general, you could say that acting by the rules and through international organizations is definitely much closer to the European way of doing things. There's been quite a lot of friendly talk and already some action. For instance, Biden has stopped the reduction of troops, of US troops in Germany. It is also some trade diplomats also say that they're working quite hard on the elimination of the aluminium and steel tariffs on Europe. Of course, there's no question anymore of this trade war on European autos that was a permanent sword of Damocles at the time of Trump. There seems to be goodwill to solve the Airbus-Boeing dispute, but I would be very careful before being enthusiastic on this, as it's somewhat of a permanent dispute that has been lasting many decades. Of course, there's also plenty of stated intentions on cooperation for GAFA, taxation and climate change, but we are only at the very beginning here. Another thing that I believe may matter for Western Europe especially is that the Biden, for different reasons, the Biden administration is much less friendly to Russia and to Turkey than Trump was. And this may matter, of course, because we've seen a number of episodes in past years where the leaders of those countries would initiate some standoffs with the European Union, of course, with a lesser probability of dividing Western powers and a stronger probability that the US stands behind the EU in some confrontation, that will of course enter the risk-reward calculation before initiating any form of standoff of this type. Now, when I say, importantly, when I say Biden is very pro-multilateral organization, there's an important caveat. Both Biden and Yellen have stated that they have no intention to re-enter major trade treaties before they have conducted major investment at home. So we should not expect some rapid, maybe with the UK, because of course there's a change of situation due to Brexit, but otherwise we should not expect new trade treaties to come in this administration. It would not be the standard scenario at the moment. And then obviously there's a tension. There's a tension between the Buy America agenda and the defense of free trade, and Democrats are certainly not, and neither are all Republicans so attached to free trade anymore. Finally, one area of the world where there have been very clear signals of change is the Middle East. I believe the Biden administration has given very serious signals, probably above forecast before the election, that they are serious about rejoining the Iran nuclear deal and want to be less aligned with the Saudi monarchies. Obviously, with Iran, there's a sequencing problems: who eliminates the sanctions first, and who stops enriching uranium first. Maybe that can be resolved in part thanks to European intermediation. There is an Iranian election in June that may somewhat complicate things. I'm not a specialist, but to my understanding, President Rouhani could be replaced by a more hardline figure. And then there are clear signals towards Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with some freeze of arms sales and the cancellation of the branding of the Yemeni Houthi movement as terrorists. So they basically remained a terrorist movement only for 2 weeks or so before that designation was removed by Biden. So quite clear signals on the Middle East as well. All in all, I would summarize this as a radical change in communication, and I believe that there will probably be very substantial changes in action also when it comes to international affairs. Nonetheless, we should also stress that expectations of change from the public may be actually very high, and we must not forget that in this situation, maybe we saw a bit of this with Obama before. It creates a situation where there's room for disappointment. Foreign policy, by definition, has a lot of inertia, and obviously the US will continue to pursue their own strategic and commercial interests, sometimes in a unilateral way, when they believe that these interests are really at stake. So a lot of room for change, but don't get carried away by exaggeratedly optimistic expectations.
Okay, so a calmer environment, but not the brightest environment that we have been through in the past. So thank you, Tristan. Sarah, you shared with us a very interesting articles by Larry Summers. In this article, Larry Summers highlighted that the stimulus is 3 times bigger than the output gap or the output shortfall. And throwing so much money into the economy in such a very short time could cause quickly some trouble for the US economy if it is not well managed on the inflation front. What's your bet on, what's your view on this, Sarah? And more importantly, how do you see the trade-off in between we started the economy with stimulus, having a monetary policy accommodating to this fiscal policy, well articulated with Janet Yellen at the top of the Treasury, and preventing any risk of inflation?
Well, I would say, first of all, I mean, we've heard in the last few days from Jay Powell who has said that he certainly and the Fed board certainly don't have inflation concerns, and they're prepared to continue to be quite accommodative. I mean, the output gap is, there are many estimates of the output gap, and it's fair to say that Larry Summers and Powell have just very different views of this. I mean, my observation is that central banks, and I would say this generally, I would love to have the problem of a bit more inflation. We've had this prolonged period of very low interest rates, not just in the US, but in Europe, because we have had oftentimes lower productivity growth, and it has been, central bankers generally would probably prefer to be able to get to a point where they could have monetary policy somewhat more normalized and be able to manage economic cycles through rate changes. So, I mean, I can say, it's certainly Larry Summers' editorial in the Washington Post stimulated a large amount of debate within the US, also because, of course, Larry Summers is also a Democrat. He's a former Democratic Secretary of the Treasury. But again, I think we've got a pretty clear signal from the Fed that this is not a worry that they see. And also, I mean, the Fed also has not just the dual mandate of employment and price stability, but the Fed is also very clearly focusing on, I'm going to go back to that word again, issues of inequality. And so we're going to also be watching very closely what's happening with wage developments for different income cohorts in the US economy as well. So, I mean, it used to be unthinkable that you would hear central bankers talk about questions of inequality, and now it's become something that is discussed much more regularly.
Okay. Tristan, do you consider this as the exit strategy to be at risk at some point?
Yes, well, there's a lot of noise around, of course, and a lot of attention to the inflation theme. I think we are very much going to witness by the middle of this year, basically, inflation, at least inflation expectations, fueled by two big forces, which is, of course, this very large stimulus bill, even if it's a bit scaled down by before it is implemented, and that should come almost at the same time where we get the basis effects from oil prices that on a 1 year basis will be compared to that period where oil prices, if you remember, were negative. So I definitely believe that the inflation theme is going to make a lot of noise in the coming weeks and months. Now the caveat to this, and this is quite frankly, this is the topic we're currently discussing in our teams, is that they are both a bit of one-offs. So of course, once after they skyrocket, the basis effect of oil prices are going to fade away during H2, and then that very big stimulus is a bit front-loaded. You have more fiscal spending coming later on through the infrastructure bill and possibly other programs. But even though the amount for the infrastructure bill, the stated amount may be quite large, it is spread over many years. So we may be in a situation where there's this big one-off surge in stimulus, steroid in inflation and growth, and then the Fed could be a bit worried that we do not have so much ammunition coming at the same pace in the months after. So we're not so completely persuaded. We believe that the Fed will be very, very cautious. We want to look if these increases on both macrometric inflation or growth are really permanent before it moves. Until recently, we did not really believe that the Fed would initiate any, even pre-announce any form of tapering before the end of 2022. It's sure that given the magnitude of the stimulus, the probability has increased that it could be before this, but mind that a lot is coming very quickly in terms of stimulus, and then there's the question of sustainability. So
okay, Okay, so we have some very interesting questions from the audience, and please just send your question in the chat if you want to ask to Sarah and Tristan. First question, I don't take by the order, but the first question I find it's very interesting on the green transition. So we know that there are lots of lobbies in the United States for oil, and this is an oil country, the biggest oil producer in the world up to recently, but declining now. So can we trust Biden when he is willing to accelerate this climate transition? Will he have the means to do it, the political capital to do it? And there is another question at one of the first questions from Kassem on the midterm election, knowing that the midterm election is only in 2 years, and breaking the oil industry can create some loss into this midterm election. So if we combine these two questions on accelerating climate, the climate agenda, and facing the midterm election against a very powerful oil industry. Sarah, you want to take it?
It wouldn't necessarily just be about the oil industry. I mean, I've talked about the political dynamics within the Democratic Party itself. You obviously have a progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is pushing the green agenda very, very hard. It's clear that green infrastructure, green jobs are going to be an important part of the infrastructure plans that the Biden administration puts forth. But remember what I said about the filibuster and who some of the most powerful people in Washington are. You may not know much about West Virginia. It's not someplace most people on this call have probably ever been. West Virginia is synonymous with one thing. It's not oil, but it's coal. Joe Manchin, when he ran for Senate for the first time, ran a very famous ad where he basically, I mean, it's, you have to bear in mind the levels of gun ownership in a lot of the US to understand these ads, but he actually fired a shotgun at the cap and trade bill and said under no circumstances he was going to vote for it. So you do have powerful forces within the Democratic Party who are going to be quite skeptical of some parts of a green agenda. Like I say, where you're talking about green infrastructure, green jobs, things that can replace and be higher paying jobs than in some of the carbon producing industries, that's something that may have some traction. But again, if coming back to this question about the 2022 midterm elections, the point that the Biden administration is going to want to try to make to the American people and to those few voters who are willing to swing between a Republican vote and a Democratic vote is going to be what is it that the administration has done to improve their lives, not trying to satisfy some agenda being pushed by people who, in some cases have been rather demonized by some parts of the press. So it's all going to be about wanting to make it clear that they're trying to improve the lives and the standard of living of everyday people. Where the green agenda fits into that, like with creating better paying jobs, I think it's fair to assume that the administration is going to push it. But I think there are limitations to where they would be willing to go, given, again, I wouldn't talk so much about oil lobbies. It's the dynamics and the economies of individual states and the jobs that depend on those industries within individual states. That's going to be a key driving force too.
Thank you. A question for you, Tristan, on the digital tax. So you say that the US are ready to go back to international institutions like OECD. The OECD has been promoted as a kind of arbiter for setting up a fair digital taxation at the international level. Would you, in very short, can we expect something on this front quickly? And can we also expect to resolve some of the long-term dispute in between the US and Europe on the aircraft industries and the tariff on the aircraft industries.
Yes, I think these are two very complex topics where I would not be expecting the most rapid of the breakthrough. I think there are other areas of US-Euro relationship where you can more quickly make progress, like removal of tariffs and so on. For the digital taxation, I think there's been a number of stated intentions of goodwill. I believe I'm clearly not a specialist of the topic, but I believe that two of the policy directions is a better split of taxation across countries and a minimum tax on the revenue of these countries. I would not be totally persuaded that despite these good intentions, despite cooperation also to nominate a new chair for the OECD, you're really going to see full agreement on the topic. So that would not be the area where I would be the most optimistic. And again, the overall topic of big tech regulation and taxation is incredibly complex in the US itself. I think it would be also the case for the Boeing Airbus dispute. What I sometimes hear is that China, it also has to do with China emerging as a new aircraft manufacturing power, so you need to calm the dispute and possibly to try to move towards cooperation. This has been, however, a very long, multi-decade conflict. I think the scope for resolution is a bit better than it was before. Again, I certainly would not guarantee that we come to full agreement on this.
Okay. Talking about human rights or authoritarian countries, there is a very interesting question on Venezuela. It was, which is supposed as Latin America to be the area under the protection of the US or under the supervision of the US. There was some big tension in between the Trump administration and Venezuela. Would you expect, Sarah, Biden to be much more aggressive, or at least much more entrepreneurial on fixing the situation in Venezuela, the dramatic situation?
I mean, to be perfectly frank, and again, this is a bit outside my area of expertise. The main priorities of this administration are going to be domestic. I completely agree with what Tristan has said in terms of, I think there will be a huge change in tone. You can already see a huge change in tone. But the things that are really going to be preoccupying the bulk of the administration's time are really the domestic economic issues. My understanding is that there are no stated policy positions or decisions one way or another on this. But again, this is far enough outside my area of the countries that I follow on a regular basis where I don't really want to speculate one way or the other. So I think I have to be humble and just say pass. I don't know.
Okay,
so
I would say I'm not aware of any harsh, strong statement of intention towards Venezuela. Nonetheless, my take would be that they would be less pushy on the topic than Trump was very obviously, and that even Venezuela may have some sympathy with some tiny leftist minority in the Democratic Party. That overall, that in my view, that should not be a priority in the coming months and years.
Okay, so we are running out of time, and I would like to ask you both if you can answer to me very shortly on what could be for 2021 your three upside risks and your three downside risks. Tristan, you want to start?
upside for upside risks, I think one of the most interesting topics is whether the COVID crisis can lead to lasting productivity gains. We know we've seen that there's been a number of transformation of the way of working, of doing business including through teleconferencing, and this is what we are doing at the moment. There are convincing studies that, and even some medical progress, that this type of crisis, even though depressing obviously GDP in their first effect, can after a while lead to some slightly more rapid growth in productivity, and that's I think a very interesting thing to follow in the coming months and years. I think another upside risk is indeed if Biden policies are after all successful in building at least the perception of a more inclusive society. In my view, there's very little evidence or case of a developed economy in the past decade or even decades that would have succeeded in reducing inequalities. It seems that they are basically not on the world scale. It's different in emerging economies, but in Western countries, more or less, they seem to be increasing everywhere. Now, there's this stated intention to reduce them. I think any success in doing this would be extremely positive for the Biden administration and for also the spillovers it can have on other countries. And then there's a possibility, I believe, I've commented on regulation of a number of sectors. There is the possibility of a win-win situation if you are capable of engineering some regulation that makes things not necessarily that can liberate some competition, some positive incentives, some innovation, then that can be a net positive for the economy. So there's the potential in the stated promises of the Biden agenda, and even in the current dire situation of the economy to exit to the upside. These are for upside risks. What could go wrong in the negative risks? Well, obviously, risk number one to me is new hiccups in the COVID crisis. I stated that the U.S. vaccination campaign is not doing that bad, but common to the US and the other countries is that we do not know how resistant to the vaccines these new variants are, nor if there cannot be new even new variants that we don't know about. So we are not done with the COVID crisis, and this remains the main risk at the moment. I think we cannot completely rule out a serious US-China geopolitical accident. This was already the case under Trump. It will not disappear. If it happens, from the market point of view, it may dwarf all the other topics. And then on the negative risks, you also have the possibility that Biden policies only polarize further the US political life and public opinion, which is already very much polarized, that you continue to have a country with a 50-50 split, that come another Republican president, he will just put a lot of energy in undoing everything that Biden has done. And basically you don't mend that rift, you don't mend society, you keep the divide wide open.
Okay, thank you, Tristan. Sarah, your take?
I'd agree with the upside risk of some of the positive trends that we had seen going into the pandemic being accelerated by the pandemic. We've seen a huge amount of technological change be able to be adopted, the way people work being adopted. And that's something, in some ways this can have some negative spillover effects, but I think there's certainly some good opportunities there. I think this focus on inequality is something that also potentially produces some upside in terms of the potential to really calm some of the rather toxic political dynamics within the country, some of which are linked to inequality, though I mean the driving forces of that is a whole other webinar in itself. But certainly, I mean, if you look at all measures of inequality in the US, they are far greater than what we see here in Europe. And so I think it is, you know, a significant problem. I think also with regard to infrastructure and the focus on the green economy, there's also some real potential for the development of further world-leading industries that are going to really be the industries that help to drive the economy forward over, you know, the coming decade. So these aren't necessarily 2021 upside risks, but longer term. As far as the downside goes, I mean, clearly the most immediate downside risk is new variants of the coronavirus, which then cause further disruptions to the economy, and particularly if those variants are not as effectively combated with the vaccinations that have been developed. I would say, I mean, it's quite a micro level risk and it's a bit morbid, but bearing in mind how razor thin the Senate majority is, there is a risk of resumed gridlock. All you need to have is, I mean, the average age of senators, I haven't looked up what it is, but it's high. This is not a very youthful legislative body. And I mean, so the risk that a senator could be, unable to serve, and therefore, again, sort of have just the gridlock within the body. That's something which I think is an important risk, given that some of what this administration wants to achieve will demand legislation. And I would say also, just to bring home the point about deep divisions within American society. I mean, in some respects, there is not a common understanding between very divided parts of the country, even on a common set of facts. And this is a place that's a bit different than the US has been before. As I said earlier, there's a very small number of persuadable voters. And so just a continuation of this heavily divided country. Biden tried in his inaugural address to make very clear that he wants to try to bridge that divide and try to reunify the country, but that is a very big project. And I would certainly say a downside risk to take seriously is that the kinds of divisions that we've seen persist, and in some respects perhaps even get worse.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much also, Tristan. What I can say for this discussion, very interesting discussion, is that while we wanted to speak about the US economy, we spoke a lot about politics, we spoke a lot about international affairs, and we spoke a lot about political institutions. I'm very to have two optimistic economists for the year 2021 is look like it's it will be a very exciting and very promising year. But I have also noted that long-term challenges will remain, and I have noticed from this discussion two topics who came very frequently. The first one is inequality, which is sometimes far from the discussions that we currently have on economics, but it's coming back very often. And the second is global leadership. And I guess having this discussion and having this in mind will be very helpful for the audience. And I really thank you very much, Sarah Carlson and Tristan Perrier, for this first macroeconomic series. And I look forward to seeing you for the next session. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.